Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover Aesop's Fables. This is book 11 for my 2024 reading list. Well, I've heard about these fables for most of my life. I've been familiar with them as a whole in terms of there being a collection of fables. But then I've also been familiar with some of the individual fables, and I'm sure you recognize these as well. The tortoise and the hare, the boy who cried wolf, the goose that laid the golden egg. Nearly all of these stories, they follow a similar format. It's a short story containing animals, and then there's always this kind of hidden moral in the story. And the version that I read actually had that hidden moral at the very end. So there would be this short story. The version I read was also illustrated, so many of them had illustrations, and then the story, and then like a one-liner at the end that would be the moral of the story. So like the remedy is often as bad as the disease, and things like that. I guess what I didn't realize about these fables was that they came from they're attributed to a person named Aesop. I mean, that seems obvious, but I never knew who Aesop was. I didn't know he was a Greek, and I didn't know that he was born in 620 BC. So that places him after Homer. That places him in the great books list around that time. And so I actually read this pretty shortly after reading Homer. And so the collection is that, and what was, I guess, strange to me about this collection is there were a lot of references to the Roman names of the gods, to things that happened much later in history, and so there's no way that Aesop wrote all of these. There's no way that he collected all of these when they're referring to things many hundreds of years after his life. So it is kind of that idea of a collection. I think about it kind of in the sense of earlier this year I read Homer's hymns, and they weren't necessarily written by Homer, but they are hymns attributed to Homer. And so it's kind of like from the studio of Homer. Maybe Homer's students wrote these, or people trying to write in the style of Homer. Similar to maybe to how some paintings would be from the studio of Leonardo da Vinci, or they weren't necessarily painted by him, but perhaps by his students, or later on, just kind of in the style of Leonardo. So that's what seems to be going on here. In fact, some people think that Aesop didn't write any of these, but there was a historical figure named Aesop who was a storyteller. And so he probably came up with some of these. Whether he wrote them down or not, I don't know. But there is this kind of idea that it's a collection, and it contains things well past his life. So it's just more kind of the style at that point of these animal type stories with a hidden moral. What we do know of Aesop is that he was a slave, in that he was ugly, which not the best thing to be remembered for, but at least he had the storyteller side of it as well. But he lived in Sardis, which is in modern day Turkey, and at some point in his life, things shifted to where he either was no longer a slave, or he just, through his storytelling or other things, he was able to be around like the court of King Croesus. And you may have heard that name. He shows up in Herodotus. And Croesus, there's this famous story where he encountered the Greek sage Solon. And Solon, Croesus is talking to Solon about, what makes the happiest person, and Croesus thinks that he's going to be the happiest. That Solon will say that he's one of the happiest people, but he doesn't. Solon gives three other people, and just he gives the statement that you can't measure someone's happiness until their life is over. You can't. A life cannot be judged until after death, and that's something I've seen pop up, even pop up in Aeschylus in the Oresteia. There's that idea there, and in other places as well. But I think this is one of the first places. So that's how Croesus is he did a lot of things, but one of the main things he's remembered for. And so Aesop was part of his court, maybe kind of an advisor to Croesus. So that's kind of cool to think about. Just you've got Aesop, this storyteller in the court of Croesus. He's also Aesop is also mentioned by Aristotle, Herodotus, and Plutarch. So that's not a bad list. I would probably put that on my LinkedIn page if that were true. And so he is mentioned by a number of these great authors that are later on. For an initial reaction from me for reading through these, it just seemed a bit odd, and I guess placement-wise of this being after the Iliad and the Odyssey, just these grand epics, I'm just like blown away by these epics of Homer, and then I get to Aesop's Fables, and it's kind of like, really, how did this make the great books list? And it is in the sense of like these are famous tales. We're still talking about them 2,500 years later for a lot of these tales, these fables. So yeah, to some degree, the fact that I've heard about them my whole life, there's something special about them. It's just hard for me to be excited about them after having just read Homer. So I state that. There's also, like in this version, there's no translator. So it's hard for me to know, okay, what are these, what of these are from Aesop? What are from other people that just got attributed to him or are in the line of Aesop? And so in that sense, we can generally point back to the Iliad and the Odyssey as being of Homer. But with these, it was just hard to tell. So for reading stats, I read this between March 25 and 29 of this year, 2024. The version I read, it's a Barnes & Noble illustrated edition, and it was 451 pages. It took me about 5 hours to read it, and so that was over 5 days. This episode will have 2 more segments. The next segment, I'm just going to read through some of my favorite fables, and I don't think the copyright is on them anymore since they're 2,500 years old, so I don't think I'll get in trouble for reading them, but I'm just going to share like 5 or 6 of my favorites, and again, they're short. These are just fun tales. I think you'll enjoy that. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing I'm still thinking about after having read the Fables. So in addition to having been the originator of many of these fables, Aesop also shows up in some of them. And here's one that I enjoyed. And so the ones I'm going to read in this section are all pretty short. So this one's called Aesop at Play. An Athenian once found Aesop joining merrily in the sports of some children. He ridiculed him for his want of gravity. And Aesop good-temperedly took up a bow, unstrung it, and laid it at his feet. There, friend, he said, that bow, if kept always strained, would lose its spring, and probably snap. Let it go free sometimes, and it will be the fitter for use when it is wanted. And that's the end of that one. The moral of the story, or what's written at the bottom, it says, wise play makes wise work. I studied at Oxford one summer, and the saying there was work hard, play hard. So a very similar sentiment to that. But I just love that idea. Aesop picks up this bow and arrow, and he looks at the bow and the string, and if that string is always pulled tight, it will be a useless bow and arrow. The next one is called The Bald Knight, and since I'm bald, I identified with this one, and I really enjoyed it. So here we go, The Bald Knight. A certain knight who wore a wig to conceal his baldness was out hunting one day. A sudden gust of wind carried away his wig and showed his bald pate. His friends all laughed heartily at the odd figure he made, but the old fellow, so far from being put out, laughed as heartily as any of them. Is it any wonder, he said, that another man's hair shouldn't keep on my head when my own wouldn't stay there? Every event has its reason. That's the end of that one. So in addition to having a moral, a lot of these are quite humorous as well. The next one is called The Wind and the Sun. And if you listen to the Econ Talk podcast with Russ Roberts, he mentions this one quite often. And so it was fun just to see this one come up. The Wind and the Sun. A dispute once arose between the north wind and the sun as to which was the stronger of the two. Seeing a traveler on his way, they agreed to see which could the sooner get his cloak off him. The north wind began and sent a furious blast, which, at the onset, nearly tore the cloak from its fastenings. But the traveler, seizing the garment with a firm grip, held it round his body so tightly that the north wind spent his remaining force in vain. The sun, dispelling the clouds that had gathered, then darted his genial beams on the traveler's head. Growing faint with the heat, the man flung off his coat and ran for protection to the nearest shade. Mildness governs more than anger. That's the end of that one. And just that idea of the wind and the sun fighting, but the sun wins because of the heat, making this man take off his coat. All right, the next one is a long story, so I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it here, but it's called The Tongues, and it again involves Aesop. And Xanthus invites him to furnish a feast with the choicest dainties that money can procure. And Aesop continues to have this feast, and it's just part after part of the meal, and it's all tongues. He's just bringing out different types of tongues. And Xanthus angrily demanded of Aesop, "Did I not tell you to provide the choicest dainties that money could procure?" And Aesop replies, "And what excels the tongue? It is the great channel of learning and philosophy. By this noble organ, addresses and eulogies are made, and commerce, contracts, and marriages completely established. Nothing is equal to the tongue." And then Xanthus says, "Well, how about tomorrow? Let's have the worst meat that you can find." And then Aesop prepares the meal for the next day, and every part of the meal, again, is tongues. And Xanthus gets frustrated and angry about this, and then this is what he says: "How, sir, should tongues be the best of meat one day and the worst another?" And Aesop replies, "What can be worse than the tongue? What wickedness is there under the sun that is not part of it? Treasons, violence, injustice, and fraud are debated, resolved upon, and communicated by the tongue. It is the ruin of empires, cities, and of private friendships." And then it goes on to say that they were all so pleased with his answer on that. It reminded me a lot of the portion of the book of James in the New Testament, just talking about the tongue and the power of the tongue, how it's so small, it's like the rudder of a ship, but it can have just tremendous impacts. And I just like how he highlighted the good things about the tongue, that it can establish commerce and marriages and great learning and philosophy, but also the bad of the tongue. So that was one I really enjoyed. The next one is called The Blind Man and the Whelp, and this is another short one here. A blind man was accustomed to distinguishing different animals by touching them with his hands. The whelp of a wolf was brought to him with a request that he would feel it and say what it was. He felt it, and being in doubt said, "I do not quite know whether it is the cub of a fox or the whelp of a wolf, but this I know full well, that it would not be safe to admit him to the sheepfold." And that's the end of that one. The tagline on that one: evil tendencies are shown in early life. And I wrote LBJ next to it, just after having read that Robert Caro series about LBJ, and you see his early life and in the tendencies that LBJ had, just in many cases, just utterly evil tendencies, how they were right there in his childhood, and how he was doing these things to other kids that he ended up doing as president. The next one, and also as senator and working his way up. The last one here is coveting versus envy. And we are going here, this one's called The Envious and the Covetous. Two men, one a covetous fellow and the other thoroughly possessed by the passion of envy, came together to present their petitions to Jupiter. The god sent Apollo to deal with their requests. Apollo told them that whatsoever should be granted to the first who asked, the other should receive double. The covetous man forbore to speak, waiting in order that he might receive twice as much as his companion. The envious man, in the spitefulness of his heart, thereupon prayed that one of his own eyes might be put out, knowing that the other would have to lose both of his. And that's the end of that one. The tagline is, envy shoots at another and wounds itself. And I just like that. I liked the difference between a covetous person and an envious person. A covetous person just wants, whereas an envious person is willing to get hurt himself for the purpose of hurting someone even more. It's just a way to tell these stories. And this one doesn't involve animals; it involves the gods, and it actually gives the Roman name for Zeus there for Jupiter. So this is one of those where I was also just kind of confused as to Okay, this would have been Zeus to Aesop. So why are we using the term Jupiter? But I really enjoyed that distinction between coveting and envy. So those were 6 of my favorites. And then in the next segment here, I'll be covering the one thing. I'm very interested in the manner of telling a story. In the first year of this reading project, so 2017, I read a book called The Things They Carried. And it's a book of short essays about war and specifically about the Vietnam War. And it's an incredible book if you haven't read it. But one of these essays talks about the different ways of telling truth. And there's this idea of story truth versus happening truth. And so if you're looking at a battle, the story truth might come from like a journalist who's sitting on top of a hill watching the entire battle. So they know everything that's going on. They know what the left flank is doing and how they're faring, and they know the overall scope of the battle. And they could write a 1,000-word article the next day for the paper and just tell exactly what happened in that story. And that's one way to tell about the battle. But you contrast that with happening truth. And happening truth would be the experience of an individual soldier, and that individual soldier seeing his best friend die right next to him, that individual soldier seeing the horror of war in front of him, perhaps that soldier taking another life and just grappling with that. And so if that soldier wrote a 1,000-word article for the paper as well, you just think of how different those two stories would be. That soldier would not have the grand scope of the battle, but would have perhaps something that's even more real of the experience being on the ground, the smells, the fear, the trembling, the pain, the screams, everything. You know, what's more real? But I guess even further back than that, what's the more appropriate method of telling a story about a particular thing? And so what I love about Aesop's Fables is that it's another way of telling a story. And this one has made its mark. You just think of all the works downstream from this, all the way to like the Animal Farm or perhaps even cartoons that we watch. I'm sure Aesop's Fables were not the first time animals were used in stories to give a moral or something like that. But it is one of the first versions that we have from history. And you just think of that as a method of storytelling and how it's made its way through. The other thing I really love about this way of storytelling in these fables is that it makes it accessible to both children and adults. And it reminds me a lot of like there's a, you know, some of the best children's books are ones that adults can enjoy. And there's a series that I read a couple of years ago called The Wing Feather Saga. And I will see on social media quite often where adults are reading this series to their children. And the adults are having to leave the room and weep. Like the story is hitting them so hard, and yet their 9-year-old child is completely engrossed in it as well. And there's just this method of storytelling that can reach all audiences. You know, it's not some productivity nonfiction book that's only going to attract a certain type of person in a certain age and in a certain place of life. Like these fables have the ability to reach deep. And you think you're having fun. You think you're learning about, fun things, quirks about animals, and yet one can just strike you and just, oh, wow, that is such a good thing to remember in life. And these, I think that's how these would have been presented. You know, these would have been presented to children, but they contain a moral that can help in any given situation. And so you think of these in that sense of just, you know, what do I do in a given circumstance? These provide kind of a general morals to get you through, as opposed to like a list of rules of what not to do or what to do. So I love that aspect of it. I love thinking about that. I love just, you know, how do you present a story? And I'm going to enjoy, just as I make my way through the rest of the great books, how many other authors have used this, even just to tell a certain part of a story. have used this idea of animals speaking and identifying the quirks of different animals and how you can relate that to people, but not in an obvious way, but just something that can, bypass the normal barriers that people put up when they come to a book. So to recap, if you're going through the great books, to me, this one's a bit iffy if it makes the list, but they are very enjoyable. They're very memorable. And, we're talking about them 2,000 plus years later. I'd say this, if you are a grandparent or if you are a parent, I would pick this up and start reading one a night or a couple a night to the children. You'll get a lot out of it, but maybe don't add this one to your main list of great books that if you're reading through those. It might be a better one just to enjoy with others, to enjoy with children. And then just that thought of as a mode of storytelling, this can be very powerful. So just keep this in your pocket too. And if you're trying to get a point across or a story across, this could be a great way to communicate it. Next week, I will cover Aeschylus's Oresteia. And I've been reading that a lot. I've almost spent a month on it. I've read through it 4 times. It actually took me 4 times to understand it. And so I can't wait to go through that. I can't wait to just put all the notes together and really go through that work, because it's an incredible work. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you have some insight into Aesop's Fables or something that you want to share, maybe one that stuck out to you that you've carried with you through your life. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. Let me know what you thought of Aesop's Fables, what you thought of this episode or other ones. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and I have a website, booksoftitans.com, that has a ton of resources, a bunch of reading lists, a bunch of ways to create your own reading list and to become a better reader. I'll be back next week with the Oresteia, and until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.